Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and on to I've totally lost track of how many parts this is. I told you it was going to be a lot of ethics. So, ethics of the modern world, part something, beauty, or I do want to talk about the ethics of beauty, which is sort of related to the ethics of joy, and is generally would be considered the philosophical field of aesthetics. But before I do that, I want to launch a kind of a ridiculous number of announcements really quick. My most important one is I want to say I get a fair amount of email from people, many kind words and suggestions, and I appreciate that and I thank you for that. But I don't always get to respond to every email because I get behind and then other things come in and I lose track. And so if you sent me something, I appreciate that. And even sort of the hate mail I kind of appreciate, I guess, but many kind words. And I'm sorry if I don't reply to all of them in a timely fashion. I do try to go through backlogs at some point, but I just get behind and then, life moves forward and more mail comes in. So I do thank you for that and apologize. Two, thanks to everybody who's enrolled in the class in France. It is sold out, and I am pleased to announce that I'm going to be able to offer classes here being in the United States this year, and that'll be the 7th, 8th, and 9th of September. And all that information is up on the website. So if you're interested, you can just go and check that out. So enough said about that, but it'll be the 7th, 8th, and 9th of September. All the information's up on the website. 3 or 4, wherever we are. I am also going to start doing live lectures again, which is exciting because, restrictions are lifted and we can go back to having people in audiences, which is really wonderful. I just, very much looking forward to that. And that will start in June. Probably will start Mondays in June. And that will be to Finn River, and if you're in this area. And then I will have those lectures. I'll post the live lectures again, will then be posted. And what I'm going to do is simply continue this series on ethics, except for I will start doing that live. And that series will be weekly. So I've been trying to work to get ahead, or so I have material prepared, because weekly is very quick. But that also means there'll be more material being posted online on YouTube once June rolls around. So very much looking forward to that. But anyway, thanks to everybody. So, and particularly the people who've enrolled in France, I really appreciate that. And then new class coming up. Excuse me. So, ethics of beauty. Now, this is, again, the philosophical field of aesthetics, which some philosophers would argue they're the only philosophical questions that are of worth are aesthetic questions. That might be a bit of an extremist or maximalist position, but it certainly ends up being a ridiculous number because so much of it ends up being about preference. And once you leave the world of absolutes, once you start understanding that it's hard to ground ontological certainty or ethical absolutes that come from God or from, the logical foundations of mathematics. Hello, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead and, Pinot and these other people who worked on that side of things, or, you don't have, again, the religious grounding. Then you turn, well, what can you turn to? And one of the things that cropped up and had been around for a long time, but really cropped up to try and fill that void, sort of a God-shaped hole, was the questions of aesthetics. So these have come into the fore. They've always been around, right? It's not nothing new question, but they've come to the fore more recently as the striving for or belief in absolute certainty could be achieved in other ways sort of has faded to the background. But I want to address one very common misperception, or it's not really a misperception, it's an avoidance of thinking. And this is the notion that people go, oh, well, there's no absolute standard of beauty. Okay, right? So this is back to we don't have absolutes. So you can't really make any aesthetic arguments. You can't make aesthetic judgments. There's no ground. So whatever I think is as good as whatever anybody else thinks, because if you don't have absolute grounds, you have nothing. This is sort of what, you can kind of, it's like nihilistic ignorance. I don't want to have to think about something. I don't want to have to invest in actually understanding or reflecting on a question. And so what I'm going to just do is wave my hand and refuse to think, close my eyes, close my mind, and then I don't have to address these kinds of questions. And so people will say, oh, if you, comment and go, oh my goodness, that building is like hideous. Why would anybody build that? And they say, well, there's, you can't say that because there's no absolute ground of aesthetics. So, that building could be beautiful to someone. And this is, frustratingly nonsensical. And in fact, I think is a good calling card, a good place to begin, because one of the things you will encounter if you try to have philosophical discussions with people, whatever the subject, not just aesthetics, this just happens to be the subject du jour, is people often, I wouldn't say even a majority of the time, don't want to explore, discuss, discover, question. They want to defend, not think, feel confirmed, right? So admitting ignorance, admitting that you don't know, is the beginning of being able to think. And so you have to at some point go, wow, let's open my mind up to judgment or pondering or reflection on this. And so what people often do when they argue is they try to find places where they don't have to extend interest or have to extend reflection or comprehension. And so they look for positions where they feel safely defended and like, haha, we don't have to talk about this because I've defeated you. I've said that there's no absolute sense of beauty, so you can't talk about this. Now, this is nonsensical. If you had to have absolute truth and absolute perfectly grounded arguments to discuss things or to make progress or to have an interesting and helpful observation or insight, well, we wouldn't have any, number one. Number two, math wouldn't work. Hello, Gödel. I was just actually conversing with someone about the many problems that the incompleteness theorem has introduced into trying to ground mathematics. But it turns out that you can do math just fine, even if you find out that you can't have a complete and perfect mathematical grounding for your concepts. You can still do a lot of mathematical work. Math still works. Aesthetics is the same way. Works the same way. Just because we can't come to a universally held perfect conception of beauty does not mean it is not worthy of discussion, and doesn't mean it can't be helpfully explored. Quite the contrary. So then what is the response to this? Well, there's many, but I think the simplest one, or a simple one, is to simply go, look, so I like to use Walmart as examples because they're just universally hideous. And, it's a safe target. And people go, oh, well, you can't say that this, sort of concrete building with this massive parking lot is ugly because there's no universal sense of beauty. So whatever somebody likes, somebody else doesn't like, and that's fine. And you go, right. So let's think about that. The first question or an early question to ask is, how much time did the people who designed and built said Walmart building spend pondering the aesthetic value of the building? And my guess is zero. They spent zero time. How much energy, how much money did they invest? Again, zero. What they did, and you can see this universally wherever you find them pretty much, is what is the biggest, cheapest thing we can build at the fastest rate that can house a bunch of crap that people can access through large parking lots that meets minimum building codes, or if we can get around the building codes, then less than that. So what you have here is not a question of aesthetics. You have a question of people who absolutely do not want to think about aesthetics. And so you can say, look, I can say that building has very low aesthetic value, is ugly, has is a blight on the population and the existence, because the people who built it and designed it were not thinking about this. This was not one of their priorities. Now, if someone spends a lot of time and energy and effort and maybe even money to build something that's crazy, that you might look at and go, wow, that is crazy, I don't like it, but it's sort of, you can kind of get a sense of maybe what they're trying to do. Now you have something to talk about. Now we can go, oh, why don't I like this building? Or why do I like this building? What is it appealing about? I mean, these people are obviously trying to do something. It might be crazy. Some people might love it. I feel about this way if people know the architect Hundertwasser. I don't know, architect, sort of urban planner. Some of his stuff I'm like, okay, I get it. And some of the stuff I look at and I go, yeah, I just, it's not for me, but it's certainly worth having. I would, would have loved to have spoken with him and talked to his supporters about what they're trying to achieve and how they're going about it and what impact and feel they have. And, that's a whole different discussion than to say, oh, we put no time, no energy, no effort into something, and therefore, but you still can't judge us, right? Like, no, absolutely you can. You're safe to judge people. Feel free to do that. An extension of this is the classic appeal to ignorance, which is I don't know much about art or aesthetics or history or fill in the subject, but I know what I like, which is, of course, one of those obviously untrue statements, because it's one of those self-canceling statements, right? It's just great. People say this kind of stuff all the time. It's hilarious, or despairing, depending on which day it is. Most days I find it hilarious. Some days I have a sigh of despair. But the idea that you know what you like if you don't know much is, right, you see, hopefully we're all nodding like, oh yeah, okay, I can see where that's wrong. If I said, oh, I've never eaten chocolate, but I know what it tastes like, everyone would go, no, you don't, right? Let's just clearly you don't, because you've never, it's not but being ignorant, by the way, it's not a charge. It's just like, oh, I've never had chocolate. If I say, oh, I've never been to, Paraguay, I don't know what it's like in Paraguay. I've never been to Paraguay. But if I said, I've never been to Paraguay, but I know exactly what it's like, or I'd say, I know I wouldn't like Paraguay. And then it's like, what? Like, if you've never been, how do you know you won't like it? I mean, maybe you can in some ways by logical extension. You can say, oh, like I feel this way about cities. I've never been to a large city I like because it's just sort of crowds and noise and cars and hustle and bustle and tall buildings and lack of trees. But, maybe someplace out there's a city that I'll go to and I'll sit down and I'll go, okay, all right, I like this city, right? Maybe this is the one, that really appeals to me. But so I'm kind of dubious on cities, but I'm willing to be convinced, but I am dubious on them. But obviously, billion people disagree with me, which is great. We can have that discussion. But you can't say, wow, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. Again, both of these saying, oh, any judgment is valid and I don't know much, but I know what I like, are ways of not talking about, like, oh, I don't need to talk about art because if I just see something, I'll know I like it. Or if I don't see something, I'll know I won't like it, even if I haven't seen it. And so, yeah, these sorts of attempts not to talk about aesthetics are sort of defensive. And it's sort of throwing up the walls on ignorance, because it turns out, and this is where I think the conversation becomes much more interesting, is aesthetics is very difficult and nuanced and tricky, and it is personal and therefore quite revealing. And I think this is what causes so much problem. People don't want to think about what they like. They don't want to think about what pleases them or displeases them, because it feels quite personal and therefore quite revealing, which to me is, of course, the beauty of thinking about aesthetics, the variability from person to person, and cultural similarities and differences, and all these amazing sort of facets of the aesthetic questions. So just kind of want to put those aside at the beginning. And if you hear this, generally it's a way of people not wanting to talk about things. And so don't, just, I would say, move on most of the time. But if it seems valuable, you can say, hey, no, let's pursue that. Let's stop the conversation there. Let's start the conversation there. So generally conceived, aesthetics is simply the reflection on those things, usually visual or auditory. Some theorists have argued that like touch doesn't count, which seems sort of arbitrary, but usually we're talking about visual or auditory, but can also be, people say a beautiful math equation, so it's like things that appeal to the mind. But generally, these sorts of sensual experiences that bring pleasure, that please us in some ways, right? That how that pleasure is achieved is, hugely variable, of course. So, famously, if you think of something like a tragedy, you go, oh, that makes me sad, but hence why the idea of catharsis. But somehow being sad or upset like that is weirdly pleasing, right? Human psychology, it's great. It has that sort of pleasing element of releasing those emotions and feeling cleansed and going, oh, okay, I can identify with this and I feel bigger or grander, or I feel like I've had some amazing experience that I find pleasing and inspiring, even though that might have been tragic in its conclusion. So those things which sensual experiences that tend to give us pleasure of whatever kind, even though it could be the pleasures of sadness or feeling not necessarily positive emotions, but feeling powerful emotions. And the reflection on where that comes from, this is, the field of aesthetics broadly considered, And again, everything in aesthetics is a swamp. It's one of these other, like an ontology, where you quickly get into these problems. And a couple of them worth pondering just from the get-go is, where does beauty reside? One of the big questions, right? Does beauty reside primarily in the object, right? Is there some definable characteristics of certain, say, a painting or a song or a building, a piece of architecture or nature that is in itself beautiful, and that what the human enters and simply experiences that? Our senses pick this up, and then we're going to interpret that as beautiful and amazing and wonderful. And therefore, beauty resides primarily in the object. Or is beauty primarily resident inside of a person, right? So it is, the objects almost don't matter, but that it is our perception of the object. Of course, this is going to be key. You have to have that. And it is our interpretation of those perceptions. And therefore, like, you can be trained to perceive different things as beautiful because it's not so much the object as the perception of the objects. And this is interesting because a lot of this, for instance, if you look at Renaissance art, a lot of Renaissance art was telling stories based on classical literature that educated people in the Renaissance all knew basically by heart, or many of them knew. And so when we look at Renaissance art today, we often miss the story. We don't know either the biblical symbology or the biblical references, which have sort of fallen out of culture to a large degree. We certainly don't know a lot of the classical references. So we experience the Renaissance art often quite differently than people of the Renaissance would. And yet, of course, we still find it beautiful. So, as our perceptions change, the art changes. So does it primarily in us? Is it primarily in the object? Is it, which, would be seem more natural feeling, although philosophy don't trust what seems natural or intuitive. The mix of that certain objects are very much more likely to inspire certain kinds of responses in the average, human monkey. And so those sorts of sets of questions, like where beauty resides. And so different cultures have very different answers to this, which is interesting. It doesn't mean that any particular culture is correct. It just means the approaches to these sorts of questions are quite variable. So for instance, if you read like the Taoist classics, they just talk about the beauty of nature, beauty of nature, beauty of nature. This is, if you want to know about beauty, it's the natural, it's the simple, it's the natural order, it's things that mirror nature. And so they thought beauty did exist externally because there was a normal, natural, finite system that defined how the universe was, the way, as it was called, and things that matched or were resonant with the way were correct and beautiful and inspirational and powerful and true, and things that did not were not. And nature couldn't do anything but the way, because it's just natural. It doesn't, so when you look at nature, what you're seeing is expressions of the way. And so that is your model for how beauty is, what it is. And the more you can get things to line up with that, the better off you're going to be. Conversely, you can look at like something like Hinduism and its tradition. So Hinduism, it's hard to say anything particular about Hinduism because it's wildly diverse, which is wonderful. Part of the beauty of it is it's sort of, 10,000 gods, 10,000 ideas. But generally speaking, you can look at the emphasis, it certainly is on internal processes, internal feelings, internal emotions. That the way to get in contact with beautiful affect, the way to become beautiful, is to be more true to the truth of the universe. And the way you get to the truth of the universe is you go inside of yourself. You don't look outside per se. It's you're looking inside. And so hence all the emphasis on meditation practices and diets and yoga and all of these sorts of inward looking health conceptualized as a sense of yourself internally. And so even though both of them have the notion that there are universal principles, and the better, more closely you are aligned and your vision or your experiences are aligned with that, the more beautiful, unquote, or more aesthetic or more true you are going to have, you are going to experience the true, the beautiful, more fully. But again, diametrically opposed in that, and where you look for that. And Taoism, you take your inside, you line it up with the outside. And Hinduism, again, on average, you're looking inside because that's where you're going to discover things. And you're just not too worried about what's going on outside, because that's just some sort of vague expression of, incomplete, inadequate material instantiation of much more important non-material experiences and ideas and universal principles, which is not to say, of course, there isn't beautiful Indian art and so on and so forth, but notice they put a much greater emphasis on those immaterial art forms like dance and music and poetry, as opposed to writing things down or building, not that they didn't build a million temples, but the emphasis is much more weighted towards what we would consider the immaterial arts. Whereas you can look what we remember from the Renaissance or from the Greek world, they emphasized, the physical, the built, the painted, the sculpted. So, there is this difference, and the poetry that was, the oral poetry was lost for much of the ancient world, because the emphasis was not on the oral transmission, because, you look for beauty in different places and what matters and where you look to it. So there's just two examples from two different cultures that actually share the notion that there should be at least universal principles of beauty, because there's the universal method in Taoism, and there is the gods, however conceptualized, they have their universal dharma, if you want to take it to that place, and therefore you should be able to come up with a definition of beauty. But where you look for that, completely different. So wherever you think about where beauty is, even that is not that much of an answer. It sort of opens a question. It's like, okay, if there is a universal sense of beauty that can be discovered in actual objects, that it's not just something that humans are bringing to the table, then is that something you look for in the external world or in the internal world? Where would you place your emphasis? Now, another question here, and this would be sort of moving towards the Platonic idea of beauty, is going, right, and how, there's various places in Plato where this comes up. And one of the things that he emphasized was the notion that there were, in fact, truly definitive universal forms that our souls experience when they transmigrate. By the way, this is a weird concept in Greek. Like, this is not what Greeks thought about religion at all. This is Plato doing Plato. And he says, our souls transmigrate and they experience perfect forms. And then when they come back to life, they remember that. And so what beauty is, in part, is this anamnesis, the overcoming of the perfect form that we forgot. And so beauty ends on this hierarchy of leading us back to what is perfect and pure and good, which ends up being true knowledge and wisdom. But it is because we have, in fact, already experienced existing perfect forms, which are themselves, of course, transcendent beauty. Well, they actually transcend beauty. They're so perfect. So another way that one could possibly conceptualize this is thinking in terms of, are there, even if you don't go as far as Plato, is to say, well, are there certain things that in their nature, like a perfect sphere, like you see a really, really, clear globe shape, and, there is something generally like pleasing, right? You kind of go, ooh, like globes are nice. I don't know why they're so nice, but the sphere has this certain appeal to it. Nice cubes. And then, of course, you start messing with it, or sculptors start messing with them. And you go, well, how far can you push a cube out of shape until I kind of go, well, I don't like that anymore. Like Gehry architecture, if you're familiar with the crazy buildings that he builds, he tends to, some people like him, some people don't like his buildings. But he definitely is pushing our sense of geometric forms all over the place. So, it's a challenge to our sensibilities. And so this is one thing to ponder of the many in aesthetics is, where does the beautiful reside, and how does one access it? And then should one access it? And this is where all of the ethical questions, of course, surrounding this come in. And I always think about this because, again, go back to buildings. If we're going to spend a bunch of money building buildings, why not spend at least a little time and energy pondering whether or not they are pleasing, right? Will most people, under most circumstances, find this a pleasing addition to the world? Because remember, if we just spend a lot of time building things that are pleasing, the world will be more pleasing by definition. And there is this, sort of, then people, of course, right back to where I started from, people will say, yeah, but nobody agrees on what is universally pleasing. And I'm like, that is true, but there is a lot of consensus about A, what people don't like, and B, you could just start asking people like, hey, if you could live anywhere, where would you like to live? And can we sort of recreate the aspects of those, the aesthetics of that place in the place you are? Could we try that out? And, well, that's a very different question than just saying, well, nobody can agree. Because there's, beautiful places. All the Greek islands do not look like, Mexican villages, do not look like Paris, do not look like the beautiful rolling countryside of, say, Scotland, right? These are different places, all three of which have many proponents who go, hey, we really like this. We think this is, I could live anywhere in the world and I'm going to live here or here or here. And you can say, why? Oh, I love it. It's so beautiful. It makes me feel good when I'm there. And you go, okay, what are the elements of that make you feel good, that give you pleasure, that make you think this is what I want to do and experience? And are those, some of them may not be transportable, right? Like some things like, if you have a beautiful coastline, it's not that transportable, right? It's hard. Like, let's build a bunch of more coasts. That's tricky. But there are other elements that you might be able to. What is it about the architecture of many Mexican villages that are so pleasing? Some of that probably is portable. And this is what architects and landscape designer and these sorts of people work on 24 hours a day. But what they don't do is say, oh, well, there's no deciding because people don't agree. You can experiment. You can do it wrong. You can make mistakes. Where I live, there's actually a perfect example of this. Is a house. If you're familiar with Sunset Magazine, it's the Southwest, lots of Arizona, Nevada, sort of desert, sort of like, and somebody in the town where I live, which is in the Pacific Northwest, built a perfect house that should be on the cover of Sunset Magazine. It's the color, tile roof, everything about it is just so, and if you just cover all its surroundings, you're like, wow, that looks amazing. But then when you open your eyes to your surroundings, you just go, that house has been kidnapped and taken to a land it doesn't belong. It makes no sense in the environment and no sense whatsoever because it's surrounded by pine trees, or well, not pine trees, cedars and hemlock and Douglas fir. They're dripping water and are dark green to maybe light green at best. And there you have this sort of tan orange adobe looking building. It just makes no sense. It's baffling what they were, but you can see what they were thinking. You can say, oh, they love that aesthetic. They love that Southwest style, which is, hey, very appealing. People like this. And then they went wrong with it, right? Like, oh, but some stuff doesn't transport that well. So even though clearly in this case, they made an effort, applaud the effort and put some thought and energy into this. I would argue doesn't work. But those are good arguments to have. This is what you want to start thinking about. And by extension, when I talk to people about these sorts of things, one of the comes up all the time, and this is where, again, I think the ethics become very core, is to say, hey, if we know pleasing things, well, by definition, pleasing things please us, why don't we make a greater effort to surround ourselves with ourselves, like fashion, style, our own personal aesthetics, the objects in our lives, and the objects we're surrounded by? Why don't we make a greater effort for those things to be beautiful, meaningful, powerful, so that we feel good? And it can be just the most simple things. A friend of mine who's a painter, he makes himself an espresso every single morning, and he bought this, and the espresso machine came with this plastic tamper. I don't know exactly. I think it's called a tamper, the thing you push the coffee into the little cup with. And he, at some point, decided that he didn't like that plastic thing, and he bought an a billeted aluminum one. And he said it was like $12 or something, or $16, a little bit of investment. But he said the improvement in my life, he says, every time I pick that thing up, I'm pleased. It's very pleasing in shape, has nice heft, feels good in his hand. And he said, I make 1 cup every morning, and it just makes my day so much better, right? That simple little aesthetic step. And so why isn't it worth our time and energy to ponder this, to go, how can I do this in a beautiful way, in a way that will be pleasing to me? And I think once you start asking those questions, then you go, I don't really know how. I often feel disabled because I'm not sure, like, do I really like that painting? If I hang it on the wall of my house, will I like it? I mean, it sort of seems, it's a little risky. And so I think then fear, insecurity, not that lack of certainty, right? Because it can't be purely intellectual. It's got to be an emotional, sort of psychological appeal. And those things are, of course, human psychology. Am I just feeling particularly receptive at this moment? I'm going to find that very boring in the future. Is it just totally wrong? Do the colors not work? Right? All those questions roll around your head. And rather than answer those questions or ponder them, we'd like, I'll just go with whatever. I'll pretend like I don't care, which is a very popular stand, or I'll pretend like I'll just go along and it doesn't bother me, and it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And then often it is fine. You can just go along. But at what point are we really simply punishing ourselves? At what point are we just saying, well, it's not worth it for me to think about those things that I find pleasing because I perceive the world as being either so threatening or complex or pitted against me, or that I'm not worth it, that I'm not the kind of person who's worthy of having beautiful, wonderful, amazing things or being surrounded by them. And I don't, or maybe I don't know. And so I'm afraid of pursuing that. And so I think there's a lot of self-defeating psychology that goes around, that surrounds people being blocked from thinking about this. And I feel, again, and I think American-centric here, but I feel in some ways that countries like, I would say, the United States, and I haven't been to China, but from what I see from some areas in China, I would say Chinese culture maybe sort of leans this way, like a high tolerance of the hideous, of the unfortunate, because other things are more important, like, or it's just not worth pursuing, or it's not the kind of thing I'm supposed to be interested. If I'm a man in the United States and I'm really interested in aesthetics, this is sort of a flag that I'm homosexual, and so I don't want to be seen as being homosexual culturally, and so I've got to pretend like I don't care, because caring, like, is this flag, or it has been traditionally. I think those are changing. I think the younger generation is shifting that ground. So good on you. Keep doing that powerful work for us. But I think that's been a very strong tradition in the United States. So not caring, like if you care too much about how you look or your presentation, or you really, become interested in aesthetics, then yeah, that's a signal that you're probably homosexual. And of course that had very negative connotations for a long time. And so everyone shied away from that. So you're not supposed to be too interested in poetry or beauty or painting or flowers or these sorts of things. So yeah, these questions are very culturally loaded, but I do feel, and again, this is particularly from an American-centric view, that a lot of this comes from, well, I'm not the kind of person who is supposed to live in a beautiful place or have beautiful things or have beautiful experiences on a day-to-day basis. And you see this if you talk to people, because they'll go someplace. It always happens. They'll go on a trip. They'll go on a vacation. Like, I went to this amazing place, and this was so beautiful, or the coffee cups were amazing, or the coffee was amazing, or food can be beautiful, let's say, whatever it was. Something else, I said, well, this aspect of that you could actually do here. Like, oh no, well, someday I'm going to work hard, I'm going to save money, and then I'm going to move someplace great, and it's going to be awesome, and it's going to be beautiful, and I'm going to surround myself with beautiful things in this beautiful place. And I'm like, well, that's just a recipe for everybody living in places where they just accept that they aren't beautiful, aren't pleasing, but that they're about to leave. And so why would you invest in making them nice? Because you're going to go someplace that's already, it's pre-nice. It's all the work's been done for you. And so you're just going to go there someday, like it's some vague, it's almost like a going to heaven in the Bible, right? So I think it's just sort of this transposed version of Christianity where I'm going to die to my current life and wake up in this other life. And it's like, okay, hey, move someplace more beautiful. Great. Good on you. That makes sense to me too. But why not work on making the place you are, particularly if you articulate that you plan to be there for a while, more beautiful, like more pleasing to you, right? And notice, I think once, see, if you shift that, if you say, oh, this is a beautiful place, and if you talk to people, they'll all say it's beautiful, then see, now your burden is taken off of you. But if you say, oh, I need to do something where I am to make it more beautiful, now the burden is shifted onto you. So I think this is one of the underappreciated aspects of aesthetics, because it is variable with people. Humans do come on these, ranges of appreciations and aesthetics and all of this. And so it does become a little trickier to answer the question, quote unquote, correctly. And so then people get nervous about this because now they're not asking, what do I like? What pleases me? They begin asking, well, will what I like upset other people? Will they think less of me for liking this? Now, in communal projects, that's a perfectly reasonable question, is to say, well, will it damage my neighborhood? Will it mess up the downtown area? Will it somehow interfere with something that is a communal space? And then you should be asking, like, okay, can we come to some sort of reasonable consensus about what would be beautiful, helpful, uplifting, inspirational, whatever the function of the space is, rather than the personal, which is to say, what do I think in my personal space? Like, this might not be good for a public space, but this is what I like. You actually, a way of thinking about this, again, if we shift to music, which is hearing, is I'm happy that people like all kinds of different music. I'm not happy that some people play it at incredible volumes in public places. Right? That's so, like, love your music. Hey, good on you. Love whatever kind of music you find appealing. But if you're driving down a neighborhood street or in a place that's populated with people, it's not clear that imposing that music on everybody else is a good ethical decision. And it's certainly not a good aesthetic decision. So this is, when do you say, okay, yeah, this is my personal aesthetic, but do I need to impose it on other people? Do we force this on individuals? So the ethics of these types of questions, like, where does my aesthetic preference become a problem for other people? And should I have to mitigate that or not? Building codes, by the way, do this to a limited degree, but they're like, okay, you can build so big of a house on a space, but you can't build something monstrous, right? Out of scale to neighborhoods. There are often rules about this. Like, you can't have something that's just so vast and massive that it just overwhelms everything around it. Some places don't have these kinds of building codes, but some places do. Some places then get very serious, like, oh, you can only use certain house colors. I always find that kind of crazy. Like, okay, you can only paint your house a few colors that has to match everybody else's house. But there are places in the world that you go to and you go, wow, look, there is sort of a coordinated cultural color scheme, and it kind of is very pleasing. Like, maybe that's a good idea. But often I think it's probably not that good of an idea, but who knows? Something to explore. But certainly that question of where personal aesthetics encounter public and communal aesthetics needs to be thought about. And again, this is what we tend not to think about. Like, we're just like, okay, streets are for getting people down. Sidewalks are for people moving through. Like, parking spaces are for cars to park in. And the fact that it's just concrete and pavement, that doesn't matter. The beauty of this is tertiary, just way, 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 way down on the list. We build buildings so we get maximum space for minimum dollars, or, quote unquote, highest possible function. And again, that's just a mode of not thinking about it. And then you can even move this again to another level, which is, I mentioned a little bit, like when you start talking about things like math or concepts. Can ideas be beautiful? If to the extent that some ideas are clearly quite pleasing when you think about them or accounting them, I would argue that that's a fair use of the term, right? That there are things that are purely intellectually beautiful. And that when you discover them or read them or you do work out a mathematical process and you go, oh, I think this is the seductive thing about mathematics. This is how people get hooked on it, is when you work through a proof or equation or something and you get to the conclusion and you're right. Often there's this like ringing of a bell, almost what it feels like, at least to me and other people I've talked to, is you can feel the rightness. You're like, oh, that is so like powerfully correct. And you know it's powerfully correct because you just did all the logic and you can feel it. And when you're not, by the way, when it's not working and you're not making headway, you know, sometimes you'll come up with an answer and you're like, I know that my time's up on the final or whatever. And so you hand it in, but you're like, yeah, that was ugly. That was ugly. That did not work, right? And you just know it. You can feel it. That just resonates in your mind like that. Yeah, well, whatever. Maybe next time I'll get it right, or I'll have that experience. And so there is this breakthrough that happens, or this sense of rightness or completeness, or I don't know, integrity of the process that, you know, it just really is quite seductive. I think that's how people maybe get suckered into the world and beauties of mathematical thinking. And so even in that sense, can visual things appeal intellectually, right? You can see something and go, oh, that makes me think, as opposed to seeing something and go, that makes me feel. And this is why you talk to, again, artists, and you read, like, I hate artist statements. I think I mentioned this in another lecture, because when you start reading, now you're thinking, you're not feeling. You're not having that direct experience of the painting. Say it's a painting or a sculptor. You're taking ideas and putting those ideas between you and the thing and the object. You're not experiencing the moment itself. And I always find that very, very incredibly off-putting. On the other hand, there are things that appeal intellectually, and that if you get the concept, like all of a sudden you go, oh, right, like sort of, and that can feel good, can feel pleasing. So I'm, generally speaking, incredibly dubious of what would be called conceptual art. There's some cool idea behind it, but I'm but I'm not completely opposed. And I would say I'm 92% opposed to it, but occasionally you see something and you go, okay, yeah, okay, right, that is intellectually pleasing, rather than sort of aesthetically, emotionally, directly appealing. But more often, and my personal experience with this is that it's the experience that matters. When I was an undergraduate, there was this big metal sculpture that laid on the ground. It was sort of like an S, but it was huge. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet long and 4 or 5 feet wide, and roughly an S shape, not a perfect S, but roughly an S. And it started low on one end and went about waist high, 15 or 20 feet away. And it was metal and rusted. It's sort of core tin steel, I think, or a material very much like that was rusting out there. And I remember the first time I saw it on campus, I was like, modern art, abstract art. This is stupid, right? This is a big old piece of metal rusting there on the grass. Doesn't make any sense to me. But over time, as I saw it more or less daily, after about a couple months, I'm like, you know what? That thing is really amazing. As you saw it in a changing light, and you saw it interacting with people, and the way it lived in the environment, it was very dynamic. The shape became sort of the sort of meandering shape became almost like felt rivery somehow, and in an environment that was, because you had the straight sidewalks going between buildings, and there were trees around, but it wasn't hugely treed, so it was like very flat open landscape, generally speaking. To have something that had that organic curvy shape, eventually after a couple of years, I just was like, that thing is like an oasis. This little bit of organic shape that changes in the landscape and changes with the light and the seasons, saves this entire quad, right? This whole area of the campus is being rescued by this piece of metal that somebody put out here. And I just really came to appreciate it. And I thought, oh, there it is. Some things need to be lived with. Some things need to be experienced. It's like some books, if you can extend the aesthetic sensitivity to certain books, you can read a book and not like it, and then try it again later and not like it, and then try it again later and go, oh, and sort of that moment like, oh, the beauty of the book has now breathing into my mind. Now now I'm receptive to it where I may have not been receptive before. So those sorts of aesthetic experiences. And so, but again, this is what the problem I addressed at the beginning is, but there is no way to ground this. Well, that's a philosophical argument. Okay, I will say there is no consensus about the capacity to ground this in any sense of, absolute. But it doesn't mean it can't be discussed, and it doesn't mean it can't be explored. And that is the language that I think is most helpfully applied when one begins to think about aesthetics. Rather than trying to find answers, is to say, hey, let's start an exploration. See if we can figure out some questions of like, oh, well, what if you say you don't know a lot about art, you know what you like? Okay, well, what do you like? What is it about that you like? What kind of feeling does it engender in you? And are there other things that are close to that or related to it that generate similar experiences, or, et cetera, right? And then if it's, instead of trying to find answers and solutions, which when you think about aesthetic questions, like, well, what are answers and solutions? It's certainly not a place to start. If you approach it from that direction, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I think it takes a little bit of the fear away, a little bit of the concern away. And then you can start saying, oh, these are the things that give me pleasure and that I enjoy. What happens if I, increase that? Sometimes having more of the things you enjoy does not increase the enjoyment. It just is more. So you're like, well, that doesn't work. Or sometimes it does. Or what are those things that I find unattractive? Aesthetics tends to focus on the beautiful, but it's equally, of course, the converse, which is to what are those things that are unappealing to me, that degrade the value of my pleasure, that make my experiences of the world less good. And can I reduce those? Can I make those less prominent, less noteworthy? And often, yes, you can. Often, no, you can't. It's just sort of, they don't allow us to take out freeways for some reason. I've never seen a beautiful freeway, or at least I take that back. I have seen a few, but mostly freeways are ugly. And I'm like, but they don't really let us remove them and put something more beautiful in the place. Like, take out all the freeways and plant flower gardens. Like, wouldn't that be great? Imagine if we had, transcontinental flower gardens. I think that would be more beautiful, but they're probably not going to let us do that anytime in the near future. But you can work on a lot of other aspects of this. And like, oh, how could I make my apartment, my house, my neighborhood, the spaces I inhabit, just, even if slightly, more beautiful? And then that opens up those expressions. When you do need solutions to aesthetic questions is when you then go, okay, I have decided I want to dress better. I want to improve my feeling of the pleasure in the way I dress for me. And then you go, oh, now I need to act. Now you do actually try to put solutions in place. And I would say at this point, again, because we don't have absolutes, it's not the language of solution, it's the language of experimentation. It's like, oh, well, let's try this. In fact, I don't think I've ever talked to an artist who didn't have essentially experimental mindset. Like, oh, I tried this. Oh, I tried that. They're always talking about things they tried, ideas that popped in their head that they decided they would run. And so they don't say, oh, I figured out how to paint, right? Oh, I've got it. I know how to paint. Painting is done, right? I can do it now. I'll just like a machine go jigga, 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 jigga. Well, they generally say, or the people I talk to are like, oh, I worked with this sort of green and I like this effect that it got. And so I decided to try it with some more yellow in there. And that didn't work, right? Or whatever, right? They go, oh, and then I got on this tangent of doing more lines. And so that kind of inspired me to, get a little more rectilinear. And then I got bored with that. And so I tried some curvy stuff. This notion of experimentation seems to be much stronger. So opening your mind, exploration, experimentation seems to be language that is much more consonant with the concepts of aesthetics rather than what we're used to when we think about philosophical concepts, which is probably not helpful in most philosophical areas, which is answers, solutions, truth, conclusions, correctness, appropriateness, not, being upright, morally upright. Right, so those sorts of questions that you can maybe answer, or if you're seeking for those things, then trying to think about aesthetic questions are hugely frustrating and very unhelpful. But if you can shift your vocabulary and shift your mindset to the notions, like I said, of exploration, experimentation, variability, then the need for those sorts of absolutes and stuff just diminishes dramatically. And then you open yourself up to like, oh, I can try this and see if it does give me more pleasure, makes my experience brighter, makes me feel better about myself and my world. And to me, this is the core ethic of the aesthetics questions, is that capacity to reflect upon and improve ourselves, our environment, the world we live in, for ourselves and other people. It's sort of this extraordinarily capacity. And it turns out that many of the places that we like and we enjoy and that people tend to find beautiful exist because there has been a tremendous amount of aesthetic thought put into it. It wasn't an accident, even to the extent of national parks. So if we lead towards the Taoist side of things, go, oh, nature. Well, it turns out that in the United States and many other places in the world, there's been a very concerted effort over the last 100 years or so to say these places are beautiful, let's save them. That's the argument. It's not economics, it's not anything else, it's just they're beautiful. We think they're pleasing. They bring pleasure to us because they exist just the way they are. Let's protect them. And they're hugely ongoing. We're not done having these battles, right? These huge legal battles and property rights issues and taxes and, costs and blah, blah, blah. All that gets rolled into that. But the idea is, and what's protected in the United States are national parks, and other places they're national parks or state parks or whatever, is the notion of like, no, we want to have some of the world that's just naturally beautiful just because we like it that way. There's just big landscape projects. We like this 47,000 acres to look pretty much the way it is right now. Let's just keep it that way. That's, the same thing as saying, oh, we like this big painting. Let's put it in a museum and protect it so that we can keep it roughly that way, or even restore it if it needs a little work. These sorts of questions. And so even from the natural world to, of course, museums being sort of, big systems for maintaining aesthetics, to, cities that do work on this. I'm actually going to Paris in the very near future. And one of the things that I read was that Paris, they actually have someone who goes around and tries to make sure the light at night in Paris is not too bright or overwhelming, or like to try to actually keep it an aesthetically beautifully lit nightlife, which I think is crazy and wonderful and amazing. What an interesting job. And you go, wow, right, like Paris is the most visited tourist attraction in the world, and it's a city, and so they're investing on keeping it in a way that people kind of find beautiful and attractive and interesting, which seems reasonable. But it's a huge aesthetic lift that's been going on and being argued about and debated about and fought about for centuries. Didn't happen randomly, right? It wasn't a random product. And so beginning to reflect upon these and open ourselves up to reflection on aesthetics is, I think, truly one of the profound ethical questions, because it revolves around the questions of making ourselves and our world, sort of better. Can we make the world a little bit better? Not solve the world, right? The world doesn't need solving, but maybe a little more pleasant for us and the people around us. It's simple, maybe subtle and confusing at times, but that question itself seems to me incredibly profound. And I think we underappreciate it, because it's like, oh, if we can get things morally correct, then wow, we'll be great. This is the whole people don't have houses. Let's build high-rise concrete, small windowed complexes and stuff them inside and go, haha, they have houses. We've done ethically good things. And I'm like, that's just like Soviet brutalist architecture, and it's hideous. And I don't think this does anything good for anybody. But that was definitely a thing that we did and have done and will probably do in the future, because we go, oh, I want to do the right thing, as opposed to, and the right doesn't necessarily have a beautiful component to it. We often miss that. Like, can something be correct and not have some sort of beauty associated with it? Maybe, but often I think that attempt to extract the beauty for cheapness or moral rigidity or whatever kind of destroys a lot of the human element that is necessary for us to thrive and to feel good about ourselves and to appreciate and enjoy the world. And so there, and finally, I would say is the, or not I want to say the most fundamental, but another fundamental aspect of the aesthetic question is, are we supposed to enjoy the world? Now, again, in the West, our Christian heritage tends to say, no, you're not supposed to enjoy the world. It's not what the world is for. The world is for conquering or suffering in or extracting money from, but not to enjoy. So, I've never seen an educational statement from a school, elementary school, high school, college, that said, we are striving to help our students gain the awareness and skills they will need to enjoy their lives and their world. I don't know why this is, but if they did that, I think it would be great. Let's have an aesthetic manifesto that says, hey, our education system is here to help people have a beautiful, enjoyable life, and we'll do everything we can to contribute to that. I would support that 100%. That's not what they say, though, because that's not the perception of the world. Perception of our world is we have to prepare our students to compete in a global economy, which is, of course, absurd and nonsensical, but that doesn't matter because it's like, oh, it's rough out there. It's brutal. It's dog eat dog, right? It's sort of everyone against everyone. Of course, none of this is true. There's no evidence for this, but that's what we feel culturally. And so if you stop and start asking aesthetic questions and say, well, are we making the world more beautiful? Can we make the world more beautiful? Shouldn't we be enjoying the world? Isn't that what the world is here for? Isn't that what we're here for, in part, at least, is to, enjoy the process, enjoy the ride, have pleasant experiences, spend time with pleasant people. And when you start asking those questions, you sort of start going, again, this is not unrelated to the notion of joy, of course. You start going, hey, wait a second. Maybe it's not a dog-eat-dog world. Maybe it's I have a nice, fluffy dog that I like that brings me great joy. And I really don't need to eat them. I can just enjoy them, and they can enjoy us, right? It seems, I just sort of flip those questions around. And so, as with most questions with ethics, not a lot of conclusions, but I do think that if you start asking aesthetic questions rather than framing things in the question of ethics or other sort of ethics in the sense of morals or rightness or advance or gain, if you start framing these questions, don't say, oh, like let's say you have to choose college, you go, oh, what college should I go to? Oh, what's the best college? Maybe just say, what's the most beautiful college? What's the most pleasing college? What's the most pleasing college that has the most pleasing people? What's the most beautiful school I can go to? Where am I going to have the most aesthetically rewarding experience? Right, that's just a very different question to ask. And if you ask this, increasingly, I think, to me, and I'm terrible about this, by the way, to me, it is like one of those questions you go, oh, right, every time I remember to ask these questions, things, for me at least, turn out better, which is not surprising because you're asking the question of what's going to make this more pleasing and more enjoyable for me or the people I'm with. And then when you ask those questions, you go, oh, you often come up with answers that are, sort of like, oh, that will be more pleasing. That will be better. It will be more aesthetically rewarding if we do things in an aesthetically rewarding way. Right? Not that shocking in a lot of ways. But it is a question, note, that we have been trained culturally not to focus on. We tend not to emphasize questions of aesthetics, even though if you think of aesthetics broadly as those things that give us pleasure and to a certain extent joy or inspiration, then when you experience them, then wow, how weird is it that we don't ask that? So I would say, again, central here is to the ethics of aesthetics is the ethics of appreciating yourself and your world and sort of giving yourself permission to try to explore it in the sense of understanding how you can find more pleasing, enjoyable, enlightening experiences in it, as opposed to conceptualizing as sort of a battleground or something to make you suffer or something that's pitted against you. And so it is a very profound shift of focus and thought when you start pondering the world that way. And so again, if nothing else, I would say just run the experiment here. It's very simple to just start trying to use the language of aesthetics and ask questions and frame them in sense of aesthetics. And I think before long, you'll go, oh, Yeah, this is a very powerful and different way of approaching these questions that we tend to ask, again, is in terms of rightness and wrongness, or morality, or status, or power, as opposed to beauty and joy and pleasing. How do we make this pleasing? So, the ethics of aesthetics. Thank you very much.